So hi everyone, I'm Chris Barr. I'm here with my partner in crime, Victoria, for the recap of the day. And I'll start for description purposes, visual description. I'm a white male in his 40s, dark hair and a beard, with a black button-up shirt, sitting in front of a bookshelf and a fake Botero painting that I've painted over with a large diagonal gray shape. And I'll hand it over to my colleague.
Hi, my name is Victoria Stasiuk, and I am sitting in a blue room with white accents. I was trying for a marine theme. I have blonde hair and I have brown glasses. And the artwork on the wall at the back is by Jody Wheeler, and I've put her website in the bottom just to promote her artwork, which I think is nice. It adds to my collection of other artwork I have in my home that is a combination of visual and text. So anyway, that's me. Over to you, Chris.
Well, thank you, and we wanted to welcome everyone here. This is the first of our recaps, and it's a bit of an experiment. I hope you all will be willing to experiment along with us. What we're trying to do in this session is capture a little bit of what we heard today, what resonated with us, in addition to creating an opportunity for conversation and chatting with presenters who hopefully some of our presenters have showed up. The first thing we want to do, we've started a little Google Doc, and Carolyn has just shared that in the chat. This is open to and free, and a space for folks to throw in some of your ideas. We've been taking some of our notes throughout the day, Victoria and I, just about things that feel like great ideas and aha moments that came from the sessions, and maybe starting points for conversation about things that really interested you. And so what we're going to encourage you to do is to go ahead, and if there were things that you thought were really great ideas that we should capture and make note of, let's add them in here. And use it as a place to open up some conversation about the session. So we had 6 sessions this morning, and try as we might, Victoria and I had a hard time splitting ourselves into multiple people, but we did make it to almost all of them or pieces of them. And we ran the gamut really of levels of inquiry about around this topic of leadership and strategy, and how those things exist within our institutions. And I thought maybe the first session that I attended was with Dr. Lauren Vargas, the Bridging Soft Skills with Digital Skills session, and a really nice conversation around how do we think about not just the hard digital skills that are required in so many of our jobs, but how do we also start to think about the emotional intelligence and the business intelligence and how those things come together for a package that we could consider a level of digital maturity. There were interesting comments in the chat there, even in relation to the gendering of skills, and how often job descriptions can over prioritize hard skills versus these really important skills around emotional intelligence, etc. And I don't know if Lauren is on. Just looking, but maybe we could start there, because MCN is obviously, it's a place where we talk a lot about building skills and we talk a lot about hard skills, but just as important for us to get the work done to build wonderful products and experiences for our community is the ability to possess emotional intelligence, empathy, etc. And I wonder if anyone who was in that session might want to speak to something they heard from in that session, or elaborate on some of these ideas for folks who didn't get to attend the session. Could I see if anyone, and down at the bottom we have the reactions button if you want to raise a hand, or if you just want to jump right in.
And Chris, if there's no one that wants to talk about that session, we could move on to the other ones, right?
Absolutely. And additionally, I think we can take a poll in the chat if there are things that resonated with you that you would like to open up to this group that's here now. Really, this is your time, right? This is the time for folks to really think as a group and a community about the things that we touched on today, and what we need to be thinking about as a field. What things really need to be elevated amongst this community, and anything that you heard today that you just want to give a high five, a hurrah, a +1 to. That's really, I think, what we're looking for.
I'm just trying to see. So go ahead, Max.
Jump in, Max. It's fine.
Okay. No, it wasn't really said in the session, but the one that the Lauren Vargas' session, it's something that I've been thinking about for a while in terms of like how people address soft skills, as though those skills are soft. And I just think that entire session just underscores how they should no longer be called soft skills; they should be called essential skills. That if we need to rephrase that completely, because these things are essential to what we have to do in any work environment, yet they're overlooked. And people in the chat were saying that there's no time for learning about these things in our organization. Nobody's prioritizing these things. They assume that it's up to a manager to teach you how to do it or to coach you, and it's we really have to rethink it. We really have to talk about how these things are essential rather than just not like soft. They're not soft, they're essential.
I think that's really a good point. And folks also were sort of brought up how challenging it is to test or measure these skills, how we start to think about that particular problem. And then how we also train for them. And you mentioned that many of the museum folks were saying, my museum's not helping me with this. And it occurs to me that that's an opportunity, right? How could museums, how can communities of practice, and we're all part of a community of practice here, how could we be doing a better job helping build these skills that we need for our essential purpose as an institution, as museums? And I would open that up if anybody wants to answer that question. What should we be doing? How can we start training around these things? How can we help people get better at those things? I have to say, for me personally, the last year, Ted Lasso has been one of my favorite phenomenons, and seeing examples of emotional intelligence play out on screen really felt like a major cultural shift. And it's sort of really tied to this particular session and the questions asked in this session. How could we make that part of what we do, and make it part of doing business, and think about it at an institutional scale? I think it's a really great question. Who else has some thoughts? What else resonated for folks? Do we have some additions to the doc here?
Just what I've been typing in, Chris, I'll have to say. So if you don't like what I said, well, we can deal with it later.
Victoria, why don't you offer that up? I'd love to hear.
What would you like me to do, Chris?
Share one of the things that really hit you today.
Oh, okay, sure. I'm just gonna go there for a sec. Just bear with
And
me.
we've got Lucy on deck after that.
Okay. So Lucy, I'll let Lucy go ahead because it may take me a while to find it. Go ahead, Lucy.
I was just curious about what you're looking for in the doc under impact, relevance, and feasibility. Like what kind of feedback do you want in those sections besides baby babble?
Oh my gosh, we love the baby babble.
So Chris and I had a discussion about this, and I had definitions of it, and then Chris had his. So we were talking about, if you were pitching it to a funder, what would you say under those things? Or if you had to pitch it to upper management, what would you say under those things? And I'm going to let Chris give his description of it a little bit more fulsomely.
Yeah, I think those particular terms, impact, relevance, feasibility, these are things that are very contextually driven, right? And so in many of our sessions, we have a lot of discussion about individual tactics and approaches that folks might deploy as part of a larger strategy. And so as you're thinking about the kinds of things that you heard today, are there things that you take away that you as you're thinking about them? Well, I heard this thing that they're doing over here. Within my context, it might have this kind of impact. We might approach it differently because maybe we have different sets of resources and the feasibility is different. And quite frankly, the relevance. We all have different audiences and stakeholders and folks we serve. So making any one approach relevant to your community, I think is important. So it's about taking those sort of big ideas and sort of big abstract things that we might talk about under leadership and strategy, and how do we make them real in our context, and what might you take away as the local impact, relevance to your institution, et cetera. And then we can also think about a field level as well, because we're here together as a field of practitioners. If we adopt certain approaches, what's the potential impact on the field of museums and technology, cultural technology in general? So that's a very vague answer, but it's sort of a starting point of us trying to think through, sometimes when you come to conferences, you have really great examples, and how do you take it back home, and what would the potential impact, relevance to your community, et cetera, be in order to do that? And so I would love to hear if anyone has examples of, I heard this thing today, and I can't wait to get back to the office. We're all calling in from our office, but I would love to see how we can think about this in our context, and here's how I might take that idea and apply it to our context. I think that's a really worthwhile discussion.
Did that help, Lucy? Yes or no? Okay. Sometimes, like when you're watching a presentation and they have the last slide and they say key takeaways, that gives you an idea of what it means to you. But because a lot of us come from different fields and different places and different sizes of organizations, I can see how you would develop a different point of view about that. One of the things that was interesting in the session that I attended was the idea that some institutions have been having volunteers who during COVID, like frontline workers, they wanted to volunteer in a museum because they wanted to look at something beautiful and describe something beautiful. So that was an interesting little sort of side point, and I could really empathize with that. Does anyone else have a hand up there, Chris, that you can see?
I don't think so. We might have to start calling on people at random.
Dawn, do you have any opinions?
Well, I am happy to jump to another sort of takeaway for me, and it was a big takeaway because it sort of came up in two discussions. I bopped around both the streaming discussion and the audio audacity discussion, was about accessibility in audio tools. And one of the interesting things, and it's sort of interesting when you hear it said more than once, is about how folks are thinking about how do we make multiple entry points into our content, right? That the idea that our contents and our experiences might not be sort of a one-way street, that these are things that you can engage with at different levels, that you can jump into in different ways. On the example of the streaming site, we had 3 case studies. Many of you are probably familiar with the Hammer channel, Louisiana channel, and others. These are organizations that decided to build their own video platforms, right? And one of the main reasons that many of them had decided to do this rather than to just put the content on YouTube, etc., was this opportunity to really design better pathways into and through the content, rather than just relying on YouTube's algorithms, etc. And I heard a similar echo on the audio front, thinking about these pathways and how you design for multiple pathways, and an interest that we might not just leave this in the hands of platforms, that we might have to take control and build those things for ourselves. Of course, there are trade-offs, right? That a lot of folks are on YouTube. It's a popular platform, etc. So that was a thing that resonated to me, and just sort of this little nugget about thinking about audience journeys and thinking about what's the front door, how many ways into our content and experiences have we offered folks, and might we need more based on what we learn about the folks that we're attempting to serve. I don't know if anyone else heard something similar or had other thoughts about that.
There was someone who was talking about the narrative descriptions for taxonomy, to change the subject, my apologies, Chris, and the imagining the future of online art collections. And they were talking about the importance of narrative descriptions and how that can be challenging. And if they are in the group here, please speak up, or if someone else was in that session that wanted to talk a little bit more about that, I would be interested in hearing more about that. And the other thing, in terms of, Chris and I had put some comments in the Google Doc, but we missed the how and why digital with Bruce Wyman. And if there's anybody that was in that session and wants to speak up or fill in the Google Doc, by all means, we'd love your help.
I can speak a little to what Chris was saying earlier about multiple entry points. So I was actually one of the speakers in the Audio Audacity session. And I think another layer to that, Chris, was that when you design content for accessibility audiences, that content itself becomes another entry point for people that may not have accessibilities. And the example there was with verbal descriptions. And verbal descriptions were something that oftentimes was more interesting than the interpretive description that was given in the audio guide. So when you design for a variety of different audiences or demographics, that it then in itself gives entry points. Another point that I would make, because I didn't get to listen to the streaming audio session, obviously, but this idea of putting eggs in one basket, like, so hosting all of your, and I'm guilty of this, our institution is guilty of this, putting all your eggs in the YouTube basket for video. These things, and we saw this earlier this week, these things are rental properties, Facebook, Instagram. And if the landlords, their servers go down, we need to consider when we're placing these things there or building communities on these platforms, we need to consider what it is that if these things were to go away, what are we leaving on the table? And is there opportunity for us to kind of funnel them into something else, like where we're building a community on Facebook, but we're also capturing emails so that we can communicate with these people and elsewhere, or we're still establishing a community on Facebook, but then driving them to a community that we own. And so it's not such a bad thing. Yes, YouTube is the second largest search engine. And I think, you, in order to, have visibility, you need to be on that space. But I think it's also important from a strategic standpoint to understand what you're doing and what you would lose if something were to go away, and
I think that
things that kind of came to mind for me.
That is so well said, and there is so much in what you just said. First, I want to sort of give kudos to the comment, because I believe Blair also mentioned this in your session. This idea that often things that we think about as accessibility features are also just really great content, and that I think is really valuable. But I also want to echo a couple of things in your comment. One, this sort of idea that, at some point in relation, especially to big tech and platforms, we have to make considerations about, are we owning our own digital future or not, right? And who has the keys to that future? And are we building experiences that are intentional and designed for the folks that we care about? I think that's really well stated, and the Facebook outage certainly, notwithstanding, is a recent example of that. I think, as we think about strategy, there's also the other piece that you point to, which is about trade-offs, right? And developing strategy is often about understanding those trade-offs and making critical decisions on a path forward based on your best understanding about the trade-offs and what it is to get to where you're going. I think that's a really good point as well.
Yeah, so I don't know how many people here follow like a lot of the developments that are happening in the creator economy, but these are the topics that they're bringing up in terms of like ownership of the communities that they build. And, there's examples of people going all in and building up an audience on Meerkat, and then all of a sudden it goes belly up, and they lose all of those hours that have been invested. So the same thing, they're thinking in terms of social media, and they're starting to look at other things like Mighty Networks, Tribe, where these are kind of spaces that they can, social media kind of driven spaces that they can take ownership of. I mean, it does bring a whole element of community management into the equation. And I don't know if it's something like, does a museum or a cultural institution want to start getting in the business of having little pockets of communities? But again, it's just one of those things, like from a strategic standpoint, we have to, what are we investing in, and what are we really have control over when we're working with these properties, with these basically channels.
Yeah, and I think all of this comes down to individual strategic decisions of an institution, right? There might be perfectly good times that those trade-offs are warranted based on resources, et cetera. There might be other times where building it ourselves and owning the infrastructure makes a ton of sense. And I think we have good examples here with folks who have done that, and the amazing work of all three of those presenters in the streaming video session. And this sort of gets back to sort of the question of strategy, right? At the end of the day, when we're thinking about strategy, it's about connecting tactics and ideas and best practices to particular goals and a vision of the future that we have at our individual institution, and I would say also at a field level, what our field thinks we need to value as well. And so when we presented this definition this morning for any of those of you who are in the welcome session, so much of what we're talking about when we're talking about leadership and strategy is about how do we get ourselves to a better future, and that better future could include lots of things, right? Based on how our values are changing, based on the mission and vision and orientation of the organization, based on where the field needs to go. How do we think about the better future that we want to create, the multiple ways to get there, and then how to align our resources and efforts in order to make that happen. And I think one of the wonderful things that has really been stressed within today's sessions is it's not just about the technology, right? It's not just about the tools. It's also about our values, and it's about the very human nature of the work that we do and how we think about empowerment as part of the equation.
And Chris, that's actually what the Why We Digital session was about. So I did sit in on that one, and Bruce was primary speaker that was talking, and they were basically running through, we have digital content strategy that we do, and usually it's from the perspective of the institution, and we failed to take into consideration what the user might want to experience. So they were offering up a different framework and saying, let's stop trying to define digital strategy from our lens and say, let's flip it. And is there a framework? They kept using the analogy of recipe. Is there a recipe that we can use to look at it from the visitor's perspective? And so I think some of the things, like I'll pull up my notes. They identified like what were some of the common content pieces that we have as institutions or cultural heritage, and they listed 4. One is objects. We tend, as cultural heritage institutions, we tend to have objects. We focus around the objects. That's a starting point for an experience, is relates back to an object. In addition to that, there's also concepts and ideas. So within these individual objects, they're oftentimes presented because they represent or demonstrate an idea, as opposed to just the item itself. It's representing something larger. Also, content can be driven by stories. So the Canadian Human Rights Museum is an example of that, where it's really driven by the stories that are being told, as opposed to a single piece of content. And then content can be driven by community. So these are spaces we kind of that third place where people come to commune. Maybe it's a maker space. Maybe it's, the idea of where they go after work, where they go home, to meet with friends. It becomes a communal space. So those were the kind of the 4 content pieces that drive experiences, what they were saying. And it really was an open discussion. Bruce was saying, I mean, these are the things that we brainstormed, but they're not necessarily the end all be all. Like, what kind of things do you guys feel about this? And then there was a point that was made that these things aren't in isolation, that there is kind of a Venn diagram where they do overlap. So you can't tell stories without probably mentioning some sort of objects or people. So you can't just have these things in isolation. They weren't just individual pieces that existed on their own. Then they went into the actual experience pieces. So the building blocks for an actual experience. And I missed parts of it. I didn't understand when Bruce was saying, let it be. I think it was just like, you present something and it is what it is. You don't add any context to it. People just take away what they want from it. So just let it be. I think that's what he meant. The experiences are there to inform. The experiences are contextualized in some way. So he used like didactics as an example of how we are bringing content and driving an experiences through contextualizing it. You can drive an experience through creation. So again, thinking of those maker spaces where you're solving a problem, you're giving elements to where you're allowing people to be creative, whether it be like a science museum that presents Legos and gives you a problem, build a structure, that can hold something, and then people get to work and they play and they use that space to create. Likewise, kind of running parallel with that is experimentation as a way to create an experience. And then the visitor-based experience, where something is presented within the museum context that allows for input from an audience. So it's really driven by, so these were all the kind of parts that they were trying to say, is there another framework in which we can start to think about our strategies of when we're building something, presenting something. Not even necessarily like digital didn't even come up a whole lot, because digital was the means. Everybody kept echoing, yeah, digital is just the means, it's not the end. And that digital kind of naturally fits in this day and age with a lot of these different experiences that they had mentioned. So that was kind of what I took away from it. That this metaphor of recipe kept being used. And I think one of the things for me was that if we're going to start thinking about experiential design, that we as individuals who work in the museums need to understand what ingredients we're working with, and users and visitors and segmentations of the visitors and what their motivations might be. That's something that we need to have a really strong grasp on. And likewise, we need to have the experts at the table that understand the materials and the stories and the content, so that we can craft these experiences that are open enough to allow visitors, again, relating it back to these entry points, allow visitors to find their own way through our spaces, but also relying on us and trusting us to have presented something that's meaningful and relevant to them. So that was my takeaway.
I just wanted to say a little bit about the session where they were looking at online collections, art collections, and they were trying to address gaps in the collection through that. And if there was anybody that could speak a little bit about that, because what they were trying to do is they were trying to reach out and get new voices as part of the online experience, that, and they were looking to address gaps in the collection in terms of Black women artists and Indigenous. Was there anybody that was in that session that would like to say something?
I can provide a little bit of a summary. So in that session, a couple of staff from the Milwaukee Art Museum. It was a campfire session, so they presented some ideas about how online collections could be different. And we talked about, the algorithm that creates that screen of thumbnails that you get, and how different or not different, the original idea of a screen of thumbnails from like the late 90s and the screen of thumbnails from today is really has moved nowhere. And what is the purpose of, what is the strategy about digital collections? And we also had some discussion about models of how to decide what gets digitized and made available to the public, who's involved in that decision making, and lots of discussion about how to surface material that is not often seen, I mean, physically or digitally. Often what you get when you go to a museum's online collection is more collection highlights, which may be things that are already on the wall. They may be the fullest records. They may have the most attached media. And what about the rest of the stuff? And how did that, if you keep showing the most popular stuff, it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So yeah, we talked lots about that. And I wanted to connect something that was said about strategy around reaching the audience. I love this conference, and I love that there's a leadership and strategy day. I think what is missing from leadership and strategy day are the people who don't have any technologists on their staff. And it's great that you all think about digital strategy. Most museums don't have that phrase in their vocabulary. They are doing digital things because other museums are doing digital things. And if we're going to talk about leadership and leadership for the field, very basic advocacy about digital costs money. Digital requires sustainment. Digital is part of what we do. It's not just this extra thing that we're going to do for a couple minutes because it's popular, and then we'll go back to just putting art on walls. That, there's a lot of very basic messaging for mid and small size museums that is required. I'm super excited. Everyone's talking about digital strategy, and I would love for more people in more museums to be involved in digital strategy. But first, we need to have that as a word. Then we can do it.
Bravo. Couldn't agree with that more, Erin. And how might this community come together to do that? Or are there things that we might do in this track next year designed for the kind of folks that you're talking about to move the focus from digital things, we must do the digital things. Here are the digital things that others people are doing, so we must need to do those digital things, to a more rich discussion about, and this is where strategy comes in, right? We have limited resources. We have specific goals and mission. How do we align those resources to have the most impact, and where is digital appropriate for us, right? Whoever we are as an organization, how do we have a better discussion about that and provide learning for folks who are just trying to figure it out and keep up?
so I think actually the pandemic will provide a really great entry into this, because many museums now have like video program, like they put things online more. And some museums are going to immediately cease doing all of that stuff because their doors are open and we're just going to go back to regular, you know, the way things used to be. And I think there's an opportunity to talk about the value that was created during the pandemic, even if it was not sustainable. So, you know, I think very basic stuff like digital strategy is for everyone to think about, not just for the one marketing person that you have. Digital is not marketing. Digital is a tool that can be used in many places. And I would suggest something like a technical leaflet, or something where MCN partners with umbrella organizations for smaller museums like AASLH, American Association for State and Local History, or even the Small Museums Association, to really start the conversation that digital is for everybody and it's not going away. There are many organizations that are still barely convincing themselves that they should have an Instagram account. And they just leave it to the 20-year-old person in the marketing department, and nobody else does anything with it. But there are, you know, I'm trying to think of another analogy from the field, where the field has changed so begrudgingly. I mean, even databases, computer databases for museum collections, it's a card file. Museums use it like a card file. They don't harness the power of the database. So there are still places where museums are just not. They're very old and they're very slow to change. And I love digital strategy. It's great. I want it to move down to smaller organizations more quickly.
Absolutely.
So Chris, I just wanted to check in with you. I guess we're supposed to go till 4, but if there's anybody that hasn't spoken yet, perhaps you'd like to speak up. And I'm not going to call anybody out, but maybe there's somebody that would like to say something else. Thanks, Erin. I really appreciate everything you said. Oh, I was thinking maybe you.
We have a hand. Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I so appreciated everybody's discussion points, but in response to Erin's comment about putting the digital strategy into the hands of more people in the organization, but also more people in the community. Through our practice at Better World Museum and Horizon Art Museum, we've been teaching people world building skills. Those are our digital tools inside of the Oculus program called Facebook Horizon. And we teach diverse and women and LGBTQ members especially how to use these digital tools so they can become part of our citizen community strategy. Now they are building worlds that are part of Horizon Art Museum, and really just my job has become to be a facilitator more than as one of my primary jobs as a museum founder. So whatever your digital tools are, if you just give them to the people and create sort of a citizen science environment around it, that transformations will happen, that empower more voices, create more resilient people, and leaders will arise that
I love
will
that.
surprise you.
I love that. And on that note of empowerment and allowing lots of beautiful flowers to bloom, we have to say goodbye. We're getting the virtual hook here, but do want to remind you that we have a networking session. We have some funder office hours, and if you all want to attend those things, that would be wonderful. And thank you for participating. And this community never fails to really provide so much valuable insight. And thank you all for being part of that.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.